A federal courtroom in Boston, early 2016. A man is sitting there who just a few months earlier was on the verge of walking free. Not decades from now, within 2 years. And the prosecutors, the same people who put him away, had agreed to it. They had signed off on cutting a sentence of life without parole down to about 30 years. He had already served enough that release could have come as early as the summer of 2017. And then a judge read something, and everything reversed. The man's name is Darryl Whiting. On the streets of Roxbury, they called him God. He was convicted of running a continuing criminal enterprise, a crack cocaine operation, along with 21 counts of cocaine distribution and 1 count of money laundering. When the federal grand jury handed up the indictment on December 11, 1990, it named him and roughly 30 co-defendants. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. That door had been shut for decades, and prosecutors had just agreed to open it. So what did that judge read that made the government turn around and fight to keep him locked away forever? What undid a deal already on the table? It was a book, a novel, one he wrote himself. This is the story of how a man built a case that he was reformed, a legitimate businessman, a changed person, and then handed the government the one weapon that buried him for life: his own words. The judge was Patty B. Saris, United States District Chief Judge in Massachusetts. In 2015, the pieces were falling into place for Whiting's release. Federal sentencing law had shifted. Prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office had signaled they would support a substantial reduction, a recommended term of around 360 months. 30 years. With time served, freedom was close enough to touch. Then someone read a book he had published in 2013, a self-published novel, and the lead character in that novel was named Darryl "God" Whiting. On May 15, 2015, prosecutors withdrew their support. On February 17, 2016, Judge Saris denied the motion. The life sentence stood. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because to understand why one book could bury a man for life, you have to go back to who he was when he first walked into Boston. And you have to understand the place that made him. By 1986, a New York native arrives in Roxbury. And the question I keep coming back to is this: why would someone come 400 miles to build something in a walled-off public housing project? Why here? You have to understand Orchard Park. It was built in 1941 back in the New Deal era, a 3-story brick complex, hundreds of units, put up under the public housing programs of that time. It was supposed to be a foothold, a place where families could get a start. But over the decades, the money and the attention drained out of it. The kind of disinvestment that hollows a neighborhood out slowly concentrated poverty into those blocks until, by the mid-1980s, the crack trade found fertile ground there. The jobs were gone. The institutions were thin. What was left was a stage. And around 1986, according to the Boston Globe, Whiting stepped onto it. Here's the thing I want you to sit with. He didn't just become another dealer in Orchard Park. The neighborhood didn't get a dealer. By reputation, by street account, and by the myth-making that grew up around him, the neighborhood got a God. That was the name he carried, a reputation, a piece of street bravado that hardened into legend. And whether you take that name as fear or as folklore, it tells you something about how completely one man came to loom over those blocks. By 1990, what he'd built in Orchard Park was big enough to bring 400 miles of federal attention down on top of it. So what does it take to run a drug market that never closes? Because that's what prosecutors describe. A 24-hour cocaine operation running out of the projects, according to the Boston Globe. Not a corner, a market, an enterprise. And under federal law, the charge at the center of it, continuing criminal enterprise, a CCE. required the government to prove something specific, that Whiting organized to supervise or managed at least 5 other people in a continuing series of drug felonies from which he pulled substantial income. That's not a street dealer. That's a leadership charge. That's the man at the top. Prosecutors characterized it as a ring reaching roughly 100 people, moving millions in proceeds. Let me break that down because those numbers can wash right over you. A ring roughly 100 deep, millions of dollars alleged, an organization that by the government's account never stopped moving product day or night. And here's the part that matters for everything that comes later. The court records describe how drug money got channeled through ostensibly legitimate businesses, including at least one nightclub, to disguise where it really came from. That's exactly why the money laundering count was part of the indictment. Think about what that means. The legitimate businessman wasn't a thing he became after prison. According to the appellate record, the legitimate front was part of the machine from the start. It was a mask the enterprise wore. That's the first crack in the contradiction that ends this whole story. Keep it in mind, you'll need it later. The court's own order also references how the enterprise ran, guns and regular beatings used to control the operation. That's the documented picture, not individual killings. There were no murder charges here, but an operation held together by force. And here's the thing, and the operation didn't fall to a raid. It fell to a man who walked into it pretending to be a dirty cop. Enter Jeffrey Coy. How do you infiltrate a market where everyone knows everyone, where the wrong face on the wrong block gets noticed in seconds? You don't come in as a stranger. You come in as something they think they understand. According to a long-form feature published by the Boston Phoenix, a piece called When God Walked Through the Projects, Coy was a Boston Housing Authority officer, and he went undercover posing as a corrupt cop. A cop who could be bought. A cop who was already dirty, so nobody had to wonder why he was around. He worked his way inside Orchard Park, built the relationships, and became a key government witness against Whiting. And here's where the story spills out of the courtroom and onto a movie screen. That infiltration, a cop posing as a corrupt cop to bring down a kingpin called God, is credited as the inspiration for the 1999 film In Too Deep. LL Cool J played the kingpin. Omar Epps played the officer working his way inside. A real case dressed up for Hollywood, sold as entertainment. But there's a human being under that story, and according to that Boston Phoenix feature, the man whose real-life work helped inspire the film later died. I'll say it once, plainly, and move on, because he deserves that much. The case that got turned into a movie had a cost that no film ever showed. The undercover work fed a case that swept up nearly 30 people at once. By December 1990, December 11th to be exact, a federal grand jury handed down the indictment, Whiting and roughly 30 co-defendants. Among those named in the charges, Sean Dixon, Ronaldo Pledger, Edwin Carmichael, Stephen Wadlington, and others. These men were indicted, charged alongside Whiting. Their individual outcomes are not part of this story. What matters is the reach. When the net came down, it came down wide. Then came the trial. In 1991, Whiting was convicted on the continuing criminal enterprise count, on 21 counts of cocaine distribution and possession with intent, and on the money laundering count, every piece of it, and then the sentence, life without parole. By Boston Globe reporting, he was the first person in Massachusetts ever sentenced to life for drug trafficking. The first. Sit with that. A sentence with no back door, no parole date, no number of years after which the story could become something else. He fought it. In 1994, the First Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed his convictions and his sentence. United States versus Whiting, 28F.3D1296. Years later, he pursued post-conviction relief, and in 2000, the court addressed those habeas claims and rejected the bulk of them. The door slammed permanently is seen. That door should have stayed shut. But here's where it turns. In 2010, the law that put him away started to change. And for one moment, one real documented moment, Darryl Whiting was going to walk. After decades inside, sentencing reform gave him a genuine shot at freedom. So how did he hand the government the weapon to bury him? Let me lay out how close he came. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 and the retroactive amendments to the crack cocaine guidelines that followed opened up a resentencing avenue. Whiting filed his motion under Title 18, Section 3582, Subsection C, Paragraph 2, to reduce his sentence in light of those changes, and the government did something that, in a case like this, is not small. Prosecutors initially backed a substantial reduction, a recommended term of around 360 months, 30 years, release possible as early as June of 2017. Do the math on a man serving life without parole. That's not a technicality, that's a door swinging open. He was going home. His argument for it rested on a picture of a reformed man, a legitimate businessman, someone who had changed, someone who was no longer a threat to anyone. That was the case for freedom. And then the 2013 novel surfaced, his own self-published book. The protagonist shares his name, Darryl God Whiting, and according to the court's order, that character seeks revenge on the cooperators, the ones who testified against him. In the plot, they are killed as payback for putting him away. The book used real names, family, cooperators, and killed them on the page. This is the emotional peak of the whole thing, and it happened in a courtroom, a convicted kingpin's own fiction, read and weighed by a federal judge as evidence of who he still was. Judge Saris found the book, and this is the word the Boston Globe reported: troubling. She pointed to its use of real cooperators' names. She pointed to the violent revenge plot, and she pointed back to the enterprise itself, the guns, the regular beatings, and she concluded he remained an ongoing threat, a danger to the very people who had testified. The prosecutors reversed. On May 15, 2015, they withdrew their support for any reduction. And on February 17, 2016, Judge Saris denied the motion. The life sentence stood. The Department of Justice announced it in a headline that said exactly what it meant. Violent drug traffickers 1990 life sentence upheld. So here is the contradiction, stated flat. A man whose entire bid for freedom rested on being reformed, a changed, legitimate businessman, had that bid destroyed by a book in which a version of himself hunts down and kills the real people who helped convict him. The rehabilitation narrative in his filings against the revenge novel with his own name on the cover. That's the master loop. Paid in full. The man's own words testified against him. He built the case for his freedom, and then he wrote the case against it himself. His lawyer announced an intent to appeal the denial. But in that courtroom on that day, the door closed again. Remember Orchard Park? The projects where all of this began? Here's the thing. By the time a judge was deciding whether Darryl Whiting would come home, the place he'd ruled as God didn't exist anymore. Orchard Park was demolished in 1998. In its place rose Orchard Gardens, a mixed-income redevelopment, deliberately redesigned to break up the isolated, walled-off layout of the old complex. The physical stage of this entire story was torn down and rebuilt into something else, someone else's home. And that's what makes the ending land the way it does, because the human cost of this story doesn't run through a single named victim. There are no murder charges in this case. What the record gives us is an enterprise held together by guns and regular beatings, and a community that lived under it. And when Whiting's possible release loomed in 2015 and 2016, that community The people now living in Orchard Gardens on the same ground he once dominated faced the real prospect of his return. When the denial came down, a Boston Housing Authority administrator named William McGonigal publicly welcomed it, framing it as relief for the residents. That's who the final stakeholder turned out to be. Not the courts, not the prosecutors. The people living on the ground he once ran. The projects he terrorized were bulldozed and rebuilt. And still, a courtroom full of people had to sit and decide whether the man who'd been God over those blocks was coming back. So let me bring it all the way back around. Darryl "God Whiting" built an empire out of a housing project the city had let rot. He ran it by the government's account, 24 hours a day, laundering the money through a nightclub, holding it together with guns and beatings. He was the first man in Massachusetts sentenced to life for drug trafficking, and after decades inside, he built himself a second case, a case that he was reformed, legitimate, changed, and he was one signature away from walking free. Then he buried himself with a book, a novel starring a man with his name hunting down and killing the real witnesses who put him away. The empire's money is gone. The projects are demolished. The movie has faded. But the fiction he wrote is the one thing still holding that door shut. So here's the question I'll leave you with. A novel is fiction. The man says it was just a story, characters on a page, nothing more. The judge said it was something closer to a confession, proof of who he still was inside. So which is it? Did Darryl Whiting write a book, or did he write his own verdict? I'm not going to answer that one for you, because I think the whole story lives in the space between those two things, and where you land probably says as much about you as it does about him. You decide.